Before we begin, take a moment to let your mind slow down. Let the thoughts of the day drift to the side, like leaves floating on a quiet stream. You're safe here. There's no rush, no noise, no urgency, only the soft flicker of candlelight and the sound of a forgotten tale rising gently from the past. Tonight we're going back, far back, to a time when the world was ruled by faith, superstition, and ritual. A time when people believed the heavens watched their every move, and when justice wasn't just for humans. This isn't your usual history. There are no empires to conquer, no kings and queens commanding armies. Instead, there are whispers in the church aisles, judges in long robes, and animals, yes, animals, standing trial in real courtrooms, accused of the most serious of crimes. Pigs, rats, insects, each summoned to appear, each judged, sentenced, and in some cases, punished. It sounds strange, almost dreamlike, but for the people of the Middle Ages it was very real. So now, let your eyes grow heavier, let your breath deepen, and allow the strange beauty of the past to unfold slowly, like an ancient scroll in candlelight. Because tonight, we're telling the story of when animals stood before the law, and what that reveals about the people who believed they should. To understand why animals were once put on trial like humans, we first have to step into the mindset of the Middle Ages, a world where every person, creature, and object was believed to have a place in a grand, divine order. In medieval Europe, society didn't see the world as chaotic or random. Everything was part of a structured hierarchy. From the tallest king to the humblest peasant, from the angels above to the worms beneath the soil, each had a role and a responsibility in the grand design of creation. This wasn't just politics or religion. It was reality as they knew it. Life was ruled by layers. God above all, followed by archangels, then kings and nobles, then clergy and common folk. Animals, plants, stones, even stars, all had meaning and purpose within this divinely created chain of being. And when something disturbed that balance, when a cow turned violent or a swarm of locusts devoured the wheat, it wasn't seen as a mere accident. It was interpreted as a breach in the sacred order. To modern minds, these things seem natural, but in the medieval worldview, they were signs, warnings, symbols that something deeper was wrong, either with the people, with the land, or even with God's favor. That's why order mattered so much. It was more than peace or discipline. It was a reflection of the universe itself. Laws weren't just rules. They were echoes of divine law, sacred threads woven into the structure of heaven and earth. And when those threads were torn, justice had to be done, even if the offender was a pig, or a dog, or a beetle. In their minds, these creatures weren't just beasts of burden or nuisances in the field. They were moral agents, capable somehow of breaking the divine rules. So to correct the imbalance, the courts were called upon, legal trials were held, and the accused might not be human. This may sound strange to us now, even laughable, but to a medieval villager, watching their crops vanish or their children fall ill, the trial of an animal was not madness. It was reassurance. It was a public declaration that no transgression would go unpunished, that even in the face of death or destruction, justice, sacred, cosmic justice, still ruled. And so, with candles lit and prayers whispered, a judge would take his seat. And somewhere in a dusty wooden courtroom, an animal would be led inside, not as livestock, but as a defendant. Because in this world governed by divine order, no creature, no matter how small, was above the law. Our story takes us now to a small town in Normandy, France. The year is 1386. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the distant murmurs of merchants in the market square. In the town of Falaise, nestled beneath the shadow of a stone castle, a terrible incident has occurred. A child, no more than a toddler, has been fatally attacked in the street. The townspeople gather, horrified. They whisper in church pews. They clutch their cloaks tighter. But the cause of the tragedy is not a bandit, or a soldier, or even a fellow villager. It is a pig. A sow, large, strong, and covered in bristly hair, had roamed freely, as many pigs did in those days. It wandered into the path of the child, and in a sudden frenzy mauled the boy, killing him. Today, we might call it a tragic accident, but in medieval Falaise, it was a crime. And like any criminal, the pig was seized, shackled, and thrown into the town prison. Yes, they had a prison for animals. The people didn't laugh. They didn't mock. They watched with solemn eyes as the full weight of the law turned toward a beast of the earth. Soon, a formal trial was arranged. A real one, just like for a human. A judge was summoned from nearby Caen. Court scribes began to record the proceedings in Latin. The pig was assigned a lawyer, someone to defend her, and townsfolk were brought in as witnesses, sworn under oath. The trial lasted for days. Testimonies were heard, legal arguments made, scriptures consulted, and then the verdict. Guilty. The pig was found guilty of murder, a crime so severe it demanded not just death, but an example. To drive home the seriousness of the judgment, the sow was dressed in human clothes, a vest, trousers, and even gloves. This wasn't done to mock her, but to symbolize her role in the community, as a creature that had broken human law. Then, in the town square, before a gathered crowd, the pig was led to a scaffold and hanged by the neck, a public execution, a grim ritual, and yet, in the eyes of the people, a necessary one. To modern ears, this sounds beyond comprehension, but to the people of Falaise, it was justice, not just for the child, but for the entire town. They believed that if such a crime went unpunished, divine wrath might follow. More tragedy, more suffering, the land might wither, disease might spread. But if the wrong was made right, if the scales were balanced, then order would be restored. The execution of the pig wasn't about vengeance. It was about healing. A ritual of closure. A message to heaven and earth that justice still ruled in the hearts of men. And long after the crowd dispersed and the robes of the judge were folded away, the story of that trial echoed through the centuries, whispered in candlelight, scratched into parchment, waiting to be remembered, here in the stillness of night. Now, if the idea of putting animals on trial seems strange, just wait until you learn that they were also given lawyers. Yes, in many medieval and early Renaissance courts, particularly in France, Italy, and Switzerland, animals on trial were often granted legal representation. A real human advocate would stand in court and speak on behalf of a creature that could neither speak nor understand what was happening. Why? Because justice, even in its most unusual forms, had to appear fair. This practice wasn't a joke. It wasn't theatrical. It was sincere. A court without a defense was no court at all. Even a pig or a goat or a swarm of insects deserved the basic structure of a fair trial. So the lawyer's job was to argue that the creature was not morally responsible. And one of the most famous examples of this occurred in the early 16th century, in a small town in eastern France, when an entire colony of rats was put on trial. Their crime? Eating too much grain. The villagers accused the rats of destroying their food stores, and rather than simply setting traps, they went to court. Enter Bartholomew Chassanet, a young, brilliant legal scholar at the time. He was appointed as the rats' defense counsel, and what he did next would become legendary. Chassanet began by questioning the court's procedures. He noted that the rats had not been properly summoned. So the court, oddly enough, issued a formal summons, calling all rats in the region to appear on a specific day and time. Of course, no rats arrived. So Chassanet stood up again and argued that his clients, being small, scattered, and vulnerable to cats, could not safely travel to the courthouse. Therefore, their absence should be excused. The judge actually considered the argument. The case dragged on. Days passed. The villagers grew frustrated. And in the end, the trial faded away, unresolved. But Chassanet's legal wit had made its mark. He would go on to become one of the most respected jurists in France, and his early defense of rats, creatures most would see as pests, was seen not as folly, but as a brilliant example of legal logic. It reminds us that even within the absurd, there can be principle. That within a courtroom filled with straw and parchment, there was a real sense of duty. The lawyer's role was sacred. Whether defending man or beast, they had to pursue justice, or at least the appearance of it. And so, in flickering torchlight, before robed judges and curious townsfolk, a lawyer would rise and speak not for himself, but for the voiceless, for the rat, the pig, the beetle, the accused. Because in the sleepy Middle Ages, law extended to all, no matter how many legs they had. By now, you might be wondering, why? Why did entire communities spend time, effort, and ceremony dragging animals into courtrooms? Why not simply kill the offending beast and be done with it? To find the answer, we must step into the medieval imagination, where the world was not governed by science, but by symbolism, where every action had spiritual meaning, and where justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring balance. In the medieval worldview, when a crime occurred, even one committed by an animal, it wasn't just seen as a physical act. It was seen as a cosmic disturbance, a ripple in the harmony between heaven and earth. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was an aberration in the divine order. Something had gone wrong. Something had to be set right. Punishing the animal in this context wasn't really about revenge. It was about purification. Much like rituals of penance or public prayer during times of plague, the animal trial became a form of spiritual maintenance, a kind of sacred theater that soothed the collective anxiety of a frightened village. The courtroom, with its robed judges and solemn procedures, became a stage where chaos was confronted and conquered. Through the trial, the people could assign blame, even if that blame fell on an irrational creature. They could contain the danger, ritualize the response, and ultimately reclaim control. And this wasn't just about individual comfort. It was about protecting the entire community. Medieval towns were tightly knit. What affected one household, a failed crop, a sudden illness, a violent animal, was believed to affect all. The punishment of the beast, then, became a public cleansing, a way to prevent further wrath, divine or otherwise. Because if justice was not done, if a killer pig roamed free, or if rats devoured the harvest unchecked, then surely worse things would follow. And so, rather than act in private, the people acted in public. They held trials, they called witnesses, they summoned priests, and they issued verdicts, not just to punish, but to protect the fragile balance of the world they believed in. It was strange, yes, even theatrical, but to them, it was necessary. Because when the natural world misbehaved, it wasn't nature rebelling. It was a message. And in those dim-lit courtrooms, filled with smoke and whispers, the people of the Middle Ages responded, not with reason, but with ritual. So far, we've talked about pigs and rats, animals with flesh and faces. But what happens when the enemy is smaller, harder to catch, and more numerous than anyone can count? In the Middle Ages, insects were not just pests. They were agents of famine, harbingers of judgment. And when they descended on a town's crops, silently in clouds, they brought terror with them. A swarm of locusts could strip a field in a single afternoon. Weevils might infest an entire harvest of grain. Caterpillars, mice, even flies. Each carried the potential to collapse a village's food supply. And just like with violent pigs or law-breaking dogs, people sought an answer, a way to confront the invisible, creeping threat. So they turned to the most powerful institution they knew, the church. Rather than set traps or burn fields, although they often did that too, communities would sometimes bring their case before ecclesiastical courts. Yes, church courts. The same ones used to try heretics or mediate marriage disputes were now being used to judge beetles. The insects were formally put on trial. First, they were summoned. A priest would issue a public announcement, calling the weevils, or the caterpillars, or the locusts to appear in court. If they failed to show, a second summons was given, then a third. Eventually, when the accused refused to appear, a judgment was passed. In one famous case in 1519, a swarm of weevils was tried in the French town of Saint-Julien. The church declared them excommunicated. Yes, they were spiritually banished, cut off from the grace of God. Priests would walk through the fields sprinkling holy water on the crops, praying for the insects to leave. Bells were rung, processions held. Some towns even organized full masses just for the removal of the pests. And it wasn't just about pest control. It was about confronting the spiritual cause of their arrival. Perhaps the town had sinned. Perhaps the land had become unholy. The trial was a way to name the problem, cleanse the space, and ask for divine protection. In many of these cases, the people sincerely believed the excommunication might work, and sometimes, by coincidence or weather, the insects did disappear. To them, it was proof that the church's power extended not only over men. As we journey deeper into the sleepy corridors of the past, a pattern begins to emerge. Whether it was a pig, a rat, or a weevil, these trials were never really about the animals themselves. They were about people, about what they feared, what they believed, and how they made sense of a world that was often dark, unpredictable, and cruel. In the Middle Ages, suffering wasn't explained by science or statistics. There were no news broadcasts, no meteorological reports, no germ theory or psychological analysis. There was only faith and the quiet, powerful language of ritual. Ritual gave shape to fear. When something terrible happened, a child's death, a crop failure, a bizarre illness, the ritual of an animal trial gave people a way to process it, to speak their grief, to witness justice, to feel, for just a moment, that balance had been restored. Picture it, a dim courtroom, candles flickering in iron sconces, the murmur of townsfolk wrapped in cloaks, gathered to witness something strange but solemn. At the front, a judge, tired-eyed but serious. Before him, a creature of instinct, standing silently, unknowingly at the center of a very human drama. The trial begins. A scribe dips his quill in ink. A priest watches, lips quietly moving in prayer. Is it justice? Is it absurdity? To the people of the time, it was neither. It was ritual. Just as a baptism welcomes a child into the world and a funeral guides the soul beyond it, the animal trial was a ceremony for times when pain had no other name. It gave form to grief, structure to chaos, a beginning, middle, and end to moments of tragedy, and perhaps, most importantly, it gave people hope. Hope that the wrong could be righted, that the anger of heaven could be calmed, that their small village, watched over by saints and shadows, would be safe again. Even when the rituals were grim, a hanging, an exile, a symbolic banishment, they still brought closure. In today's world, we might scoff at such ideas, but in the silence of a medieval night, with wolves howling in the distance and sickness creeping unseen, Those rituals were a light, a flicker of control in a world full of mystery, because ultimately, these trials weren't about punishment. They were about peace. And as the last words were read, and the verdict pronounced, and the people slowly returned to their homes, the fear that had once loomed over their village began to drift, like smoke, into the stars. As centuries passed, the world began to change, slowly, subtly. Like the turning of a great wheel in the sky, reason began to edge its way into the places once ruled by mystery and faith. The Enlightenment was still far off, but its first whispers were stirring in the minds of philosophers, doctors, and jurists. People started to question the old ways, not with anger, but with quiet curiosity. And among the rituals that began to fade were the animal trials. By the 17th century, the practice of putting animals in courtrooms began to feel outdated, even to those still deeply religious. The legal system itself was evolving. New ideas about responsibility, agency, and law were reshaping the way society functioned. Animals, some began to argue, could not possess intent. They could not understand justice. And if they could not understand, how could they be tried? So, gradually, the courts stopped assigning them lawyers. The elaborate ceremonies grew less frequent. The official summonses, once written in elegant Latin, stopped appearing. And though the last known animal trials would still echo into the 18th century, they became more of a curiosity than a true belief. A fading candle at the edge of history. Yet, something of them lingered. Even today, when a dog bites someone, we may still speak of it being put on trial, though no courtroom is involved. Animals deemed dangerous are seized, evaluated, and sometimes euthanized. We don't dress them in human clothes or assign them defense attorneys, but the ghost of that logic still flickers. It's not just about safety, it's about justice, about the human need to find meaning and accountability, even in the chaos of nature. Because although we now live in an age of science and evidence, the instinct to see moral order in the world runs deep. And in quiet, rural corners of the past, where firelight once danced against stone walls and farmers whispered prayers over their fields, that instinct was once acted out, not in philosophy books or court debates, but in trials where animals were defendants and justice wore a far older face. As we look back, we may smile at the strangeness, but we might also feel something softer, a sense of wonder, a distant respect. Because in their own way, those ancient trials were acts of hope, of faith that the world could be made right again, even when the storm came not from men, but from creatures with fur or wings or many, many legs. And as the medieval night gave way to mourning, and reason took its place beside faith, the animals slipped quietly from the courts, but never entirely from our stories. Not every animal on trial met a grim fate. In fact, some were acquitted, spared the gallows, exonerated by judges who believed justice demanded mercy as well as punishment. And it's in these strange moments of compassion that the human heart of medieval justice truly shows itself. In one record from 15th century France, a bull was accused of killing a man during a harvest festival. The villagers, shocked and grieving, demanded action. The animal was seized and brought before a local court. But during the trial, testimony revealed that the man had been drunk, that he had struck the bull first, that the creature had panicked, cornered, with nowhere to run. And in a decision both surprising and rare, the judge declared the bull not guilty. A beast of burden, provoked and frightened, could not be held to the same standard as a human acting with intent. The bull was released. In another tale from a small Italian village, a donkey was accused of inappropriate behavior. a scandalous accusation brought forward by villagers whose stories quickly contradicted each other. The animal's defenders, yes, it had defenders, argued not only its innocence, but its good moral character. They spoke of how the donkey had served the monastery for years, carrying heavy loads without complaint. They described its gentleness with children, its quiet temperament, its reliability. In the end, the court sided with the donkey. The accusers were reprimanded, and the beast returned to its duties, no longer a criminal, but a symbol of loyalty. These stories, tucked away in dusty parchment, remind us that even in a world of superstition and spectacle, people were still people. They could be moved. They could weigh fairness. They could look into the eyes of an animal and see not just a beast, but a fellow creature, caught in a tragedy it didn't understand. And perhaps that's the most human part of all. For a society that believed so deeply in signs and omens, the choice to show mercy, to pardon the powerless, speaks volumes about the threads of compassion woven into even the strangest corners of history. Because sometimes the law stepped back. Sometimes the noose remained empty. And sometimes, even in the darkest corners of a medieval courtroom, grace prevailed. In the Middle Ages, animals were more than creatures of flesh and fur. They were symbols, walking metaphors that carried the weight of moral stories, religious warnings, and lessons whispered from pulpits. To the medieval mind, a pig wasn't just a pig. It was often seen as a sign of gluttony, of filth, of indulgence. A snake didn't simply slither, it tempted, echoing the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Even innocent creatures, like sheep and doves, carried meaning, representing purity, sacrifice, and divine grace. So when an animal misbehaved, it wasn't always just a matter of behavior. It was a spiritual message. The church taught that the world was filled with signs, reflections of divine truth hidden in the natural world. And animals, so close to nature and so far from reason, were thought to be especially prone to possession or divine punishment. A black cat crossing the path might be more than coincidence. A crow calling at your window might be an omen. And a pig killing a child? That could be the hand of the devil. Stories spread of animals that embodied sin, pigs that trampled holy relics, goats that danced in graveyards, cats that stared too long into candlelight. These weren't just village tales. They were cultural codes shaping how people saw the creatures around them. This symbolic thinking extended into animal trials as well. When a beast was condemned, it wasn't only for what it had done, but for what it represented. The courtroom became a stage for morality, and the verdict, a sermon. To the people gathered, watching a sow hang or a swarm be excommunicated wasn't just justice. It was a reminder. Sin has consequences. Whether human or animal, nothing escaped the reach of divine order. Yet, in the stillness of a medieval night, beneath the stars, above the quiet breathing of livestock in their pens, you can imagine the fear, the wonder, the suspicion that maybe, just maybe, something more was at work behind those glowing animal eyes. The line between beast and demon, animal and omen, was never as clear as we like to think. And, in those blurred shadows, the trials unfolded, not just to punish, but to warn. Because to a medieval soul, the world was never just physical, it was enchanted, and every hoofprint in the mud might lead, not just to a barn, but to the truth of heaven and hell. So now, as our journey winds to a close, we step back and look once more at this forgotten corner of history. A time when animals stood trial, when pigs were hanged, rats defended by lawyers, and insects excommunicated by priests. A time that feels distant, and yet strangely human. You might wonder, how did such a world exist? And yet, in its strangeness, there's something deeply familiar. Because when people are afraid, they look for meaning. When tragedy strikes, they search for reasons. And when the world feels out of balance, they turn to ritual, story, and belief to restore a sense of order. In the medieval courtroom, justice was more than a verdict. It was an act of hope. A pig on trial was not just a spectacle. It was a promise that even the smallest ripple of chaos would be seen, heard, and answered. That no wrong would go unnoticed. That every creature, great or small, was part of something sacred. Yes, it was strange. Yes, it was symbolic. But it was also a reflection of something timeless, the human need to make sense of sorrow. To say, through ancient laws and whispered prayers, this matters, this hurt, and we are trying to make it right. And in a way, these trials were not so different from our own attempts to understand the unknown. Today, we have science, psychology, forensics, data, but beneath all of it, the same longing persists. To name the mystery, to confront the darkness, to believe that even in the wild,